Hello, national readers. Thank you very much for joining us on quite a major day in Scottish politics. The Butte House Agreement, the power sharing deal between the SNP and Scottish Greens, has finished. The news was announced this morning, and I'm joined by our political reporter in Westminster, Hamish Morrison, and Hamish Morrison, and our multimedia journalist Lucy Jackson, who is in Holyrood. So very quickly before we start chatting, guys, just a rundown for anyone that is still trying to get caught up or not quite seen. So the Butte House Agreement is over. It was reported early doors that Humza Yousaf was calling an emergency cabinet meeting, and it quickly became clear shortly before 9 that the Butte House Agreement was going to be over. So Patrick Harvie and Lorna Slater are no longer ministers in the Scottish Government, and that deal has finished. So, Lucy, I'm going to come to you first. You obviously then attended the press conference, which was held around 10 a.m. in Butte House to sort of officially confirm this, even though it was being very widely reported before then. What was the kind of mood in the room, and what was Humza Yousaf like? What was his kind of demeanour at the press conference?
It was definitely very interesting. I think the word to describe him would be very defiant. All of the questions that the journalists were asking him were around the future of his position as leader, whether he'd be stepping down, whether they'd be calling an election in Holyrood, and all of the time, all of his responses were, this is leadership. This is, he was saying that he was doing the right thing as a leader in making the decision to end the Butte House Agreement as First Minister. It's very interesting. I think everyone was pulling him up on comments that he'd made previously in terms of, leading a minority government being very difficult, very toxic. And now obviously this is the position that he's in. So I think everyone was just trying to understand actually where the position is.
It's obviously been quite a busy day for you, Lucy. You obviously had the FMQs as well, so it was all happening today. But Hamish, to come to you first, me and you obviously also watched the press conference. What was your kind of reaction to the news, and specifically, what do you make of the timing of it? Because obviously the Greens were going to hold a vote on this. That is now obviously not going to happen. The decision's been made. What's your reaction to the news, and specifically the timing of it all?
Yeah, I think Humza's clearly tried to get the front foot here. If the Scottish Greens had effectively terminated the coalition, that really would be the green tail wagging the SNP dog. And so he's clearly decided he's going to try and get on the front foot here. I don't know if it was particularly wise to do it just hours before he had to face the baying mob of FMQs. But he seems to have sort of ripped the plaster off rather than prolonging the agony. I think in hindsight, it seems sort of almost inevitable that this was going to happen. It doesn't seem feasible that he could have withstood weeks of speculation potentially. I think that the GM vote for the Greens was going to be sort of towards the end of May, start of June. So I think it was in hindsight kind of inevitable that he had to do this and had to do it fairly quickly. Again, though, I would potentially question the wisdom of doing it quite so soon.
Yeah. Hamish, you mentioned FMQs, which, as you say, it was obviously quite a few hours for Humza Yousaf. He mentioned even at the press conference that he was going to have to head off to prepare for that and face MSPs. As everyone predicted, it was quite a feisty one. So another quite major update at that point is that Douglas Ross confirmed he would be lodging a vote of no confidence in the First Minister. Lucy, again, you were in the room for that, and I think it's worth noting that when you're actually at FMQs, it really is, even just from where you're sitting, quite a different viewpoint. What was the atmosphere there like? And again, what were people sort of making of Humza's responses there?
I mean, it was pretty brutal, if I'm being honest. It was a lot of back and forth, a lot of jeering, a lot of clapping. This is all leaders from all three of the major parties were all sort of talking back at each other, and it did seem very tense. What I will say is I think the highlight of it was when Patrick Harvie actually spoke, because we weren't sure at the time whether or not he would actually be speaking, or if anyone from the Scottish Greens would be speaking. So it was actually really good to hear them. I think the main thing was that I got from it was that all of the parties seemed to be interested in backing this motion of no confidence. So other than the SNP, obviously, it just seems very much like a cross Holyrood decision. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't quite know how the Greens are going to vote. They're having a meeting later today, as I understand it, to discuss their position on it. But I think you're right, Lucy. I think from Patrick Harvey's comments today, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to see that there's any remaining goodwill between the Scottish. I mean, Hamza was doing his damnedest. I thought he certainly looked like he'd had his Weetabix this morning. He was on quite fiery form, but he was doing his damnedest to say that there was still common ground for the SNP and the Greens. It didn't really look like there was any love lost when Patrick Harvey got up to speak, though.
Yeah, he did say that that whilst it was like at the natural conclusion of the relationship, he did say that he hoped that it could still continue, but in a less formal way. But after Harvey's comments today, I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I think that was always a bit of a stretch, wasn't it?
Yeah, Hamish, what did you make of the nature of the Greens statement? And I should say to anyone listening, all of this is available over at thenational.scot. You can read the Greens' full statement, and you can also read Hamza Yousaf's full letter to both Patrick Harvey and Lorna Slater, as well as a range of explainers on what this means with minority governments, etc. It's all over there at the National's website. But Hamish, what did you make of the nature of that Green statement? It was very, brutal, I think would be a fair word to use.
It's hard to come up with superlatives: apoplectic, fizzing, incandescent. They were angry. They're angry about this, and they're not really afraid to show the extent of their displeasure. Hamza Yousaf. It seems like they also, and I'm kind of speculating here, but it seems like they were given relatively short notice of this sort of meeting in the morning, and then this sort of furious statement that came out afterwards doesn't suggest to me that they had that they'd expected that this was coming as well. But I mean, that statement is, as I say, is hard to sort of overstate how angry they were. Accused him of political cowardice, said he was weak, hopeless, and later have said that he's sort of capitulated to the right wing of his party. And Patrick Harvey's comments in the chamber today as well. Who is he going to rely on? I.e., potentially not me or my MSPs.
Mm-hmm. Lucy, I'm interested to know a little bit more about what you made of the response to the question that you asked at the press conference, which was specifically about the impact that all this could have on the independence movement, particularly given that it was two pro-yes parties that made up the Scottish government, and now that's no longer the case. You asked Hamza Yousaf about this. What did you make of his response, and what was your feeling about the potential impact that this could have on the yes movement? It's quite a big question.
Yeah, so I asked him, what was the impact of this decision on the independence movement? And his response was that even though there's a minority government, the support for independence in Holyrood is still at a majority, which I thought was an interesting way to spin that. I don't know if I would say that it's particularly a strong argument. I think that it's going to be more difficult to get pro-independence policies pushed through. I also think that, I think that the fact that the relationship now seems so sour between the Greens and the SNP, even though they're not on a coalition, I think it's going to be so difficult for them to work together to push through independence policies, regardless. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Hamish, what's the reaction been? You're obviously in Westminster. Have you heard much from MPs down there? We obviously know that some have made their feelings clear in the past. Joanna Cherry, someone who's prominently called the Butte House Agreement to end, for example. What's the feeling down there like?
Well, so you saw Stephen Flynn's comments about it. Said that Hamza had acted in the national interest. I think that's probably him speaking for the broad majority of MPs. There are probably a handful that were slightly more keen on the Butte House Agreement. I think that the general feeling among MPs was that it wasn't quite working for the SNP anymore, and they essentially wanted shot of it. You saw Stuart MacDonald as well, a fairly outspoken backbencher now, but was part of the front bench team as well. He was sort of broadly welcoming in it, saying, well, this has happened, and I think that it can be a chance for the party to refocus. It's very similar to comments made by Joanna Cherry as well immediately afterwards. A big emphasis on refocusing, which I think suggests that, at least in the immediate sense, they're a little bit relieved to not be being dragged leftwards as much as they were by the Greens. But all of that said, that was all the initial reaction. Now that the dust is sort of beginning to settle. Maybe that's the wrong phrase, but now they're going to have to go into the parliamentary arithmetic of whether or not Hamza Yousaf could survive a vote of no confidence. Is this going to lead to an early holiday election? I mean, the whole thing's up in the air. So we'll see if this early sort of positive gloss on it lasts.
Mm-hmm. Hamish, I wanted to ask as well, what are your thoughts on the potential impact that this could have on the Yes movement? We also, as we watched Lucy's question earlier and saw Hamza's response, what were your thoughts specifically about his response?
I mean, I think that lots of people in the Yes movement are going to be very deeply, deeply disappointed by this today. The Scottish Greens and the SNP working together in government was, for a good many people, a pretty solid model to have that pro-independence majority working in tandem in government. For Hamza Yousaf to effectively unilaterally jettison them, kind of unceremonious fashion, seems that's definitely not something people are going to be thrilled about. You had Hamza Yousaf marching with members of the Scottish Greens, I believe in Scotland, march at the weekend, in a display of unity. I think that will be the last that we see of that sort of display for a while. But I think that a lot of people in the Yes movement are going to be deeply, deeply disappointed by this. And Hamza Yousaf has essentially handed the unionist parties their dinner on a plate. I mean, you saw how delighted Douglas Ross and Alan Sarwar were at FMQs today. They looked like Christmas come early and all their birthdays all at once. It was a gift to them in some ways. Whether or not it will remain a gift to them remains to be seen. But in the immediate sense, they were absolutely delighted by this. And so the converse of that is that a lot of people in the Yes movement are very unhappy about it.
Yeah, Lucy, what was that like? Obviously, when I asked you about FMQs earlier, it was primarily focused on the Hamza Yousaf's responses and obviously that exchange with Patrick Harvey. But what was it like also watching Douglas Ross and Anna Sarwar? Hamish has kind of alluded to it there that, they really, excited is probably the right word by the news. It gave them something to go on, certainly.
It was like Christmas. Just as Hamish said, I think it's not often that they have something very solid and concrete to go on, I think. And this time they really did, and they just went for it. And actually seeing the reaction from all of the MSPs in the chamber, it was pretty much everyone other than the SNP who were like cheering along with them. So it's very much everything that I think that Labour are expressing, Scottish Labour are expressing at this point, I think the Conservatives are also feeling. That's what I would say as well. Having been at that rally on Sunday, the Believe in Scotland rally, and now speaking to members in both SNP and the Greens since then, there is very much a sense that things need to change, whether it be in the leadership, whether it be in the way that they sort of put themselves forward with their policies and things. A lot of people have been talking to me about the potential of like new leadership within the Scottish Greens, and also in expressing anger at the SNP for not allowing the Green members to have their say as well. And I think that that's what it should be about, really. Is it's about the members and it's about the people and the party that we should be focusing on as well, not just the figureheads.
Yeah. Hamish, can you talk to me a little bit about, obviously this means now that the SNP will form a minority government, and our colleague Ross has done a great explainer over on our website about what that actually looks like in practice. But Hamish, just how significant an impact will this actually have on the kind of day-to-day running of government once it, I suppose it is in place now. He effectively said it had been terminated with immediate effect. Yeah, well, it remains to be seen. It remains to be seen what sort of Hamza Yousaf referred to working across party boundaries with all other parties in the chamber, and that was something that Alex Salmon managed with reasonably good effect when he led the minority administration working with Annabel Goldie, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives. But under Nicola Sturgeon, we saw the SNP sort of move more towards these sort of social justice issues, and it kind of remains to be seen how Hamza Yousaf is going to make this work. Is he going to have dealt the Scottish Greens effectively a more powerful negotiating hand now that they're in opposition and can throw their weight around a bit more? Is he going to have to make concessions to the right? Is he going to be able to work with Scottish Labour?
are Scottish Labour going to be interested in working with him? Are they going to? I mean, the issue as well is any of these opposition parties going to be interested in working with him? He can try and be sunny and positive about, well, we can all get along and work together for the good of the country and the common interest. Remains to be seen if they're that interested in doing that, or if they're more interested in potentially bringing down the SNP government.
Yeah, Lucy, were you in any way surprised at just how positive at times Humza Yousaf was trying to be in that press conference? I mean, he really was trying to stress the point that he wants to work together not only with other parties but with the Scottish Greens, who obviously only hours before he had ditched out the Scottish government. Were you surprised at how positive he was really trying to be on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess you have to be in that kind of position as a leader. But I was definitely surprised. I think his constant reiteration that, what he's doing is an act of leadership and it's not like a sign of weakness or anything like that. I think that was really interesting to hear. And I think as well, just as you sort of touched on there, in terms of sort of him reiterating that he still wants to work with the Scottish Greens. Obviously, that's now maybe a little bit less certain. But given that a huge portion of his speech was dedicated to, talking about all the green policies that he's had and he's pushed through, and that, he was very much focused on the climate, I think. And I think that he touched on that in FMQs as well. So I think that was really interesting as well to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the other thing is, I would add to this as well, is that people get quite misty-eyed about the early days of the Scottish Parliament, when it was, the Rainbow Parliament, and parties did have to work cross-party, and there was a kind of sense of shared purpose. The Scottish Parliament is an intensely tribal place now, and I think that the idea that he can wipe the slate clean with the Scottish Conservatives, with the Scottish Labour, and now wipe the slate clean with the Scottish Greens is, I think he's got a long, long way to go to that. And he seemed fairly unrepentant at FMQs today, so if that's the way he's going to go about it, I wouldn't put much hope in that.
Mm-hmm. Hamish, I just want to ask you one last question before we wrap this up. I wonder, how do you think that people will look back on this period of Scottish politics, on the Butte House Agreement specifically? Because as Lucy was saying there, Humza was very keen to stress the things that it had achieved and that he felt it had achieved. Obviously, it's quite fresh in the mind right now that it's ended on quite a sour note, or certainly seems that way from the Greens' perspective at least. How do you think people will look back on this?
I suppose it would be interesting for students of Scottish political history in 20, 30 years' time, how to bin a government in 24 hours. I don't know what class you would teach on that, but yeah, I mean, Humza Yousaf was keen to stress today that there are opportunities for the SNP today in this, and to an extent, he's right. If they are able to work with Scottish Labour, with the Scottish Conservative Party, he can potentially reverse these fears from some in the SNP, like your Kate Forbeses, your Annabelle and Fergus Ewings of the world, that the party was moving too far to the left, was more interested in these sort of niche causes, and away from the sort of bread and butter concerns. I think bread and butter concerns was the phrase that Joanna Cherry used this morning as well. So yeah, I mean, I think to be fair to Humza Yousaf, there are opportunities in this for him. It just depends on how he plays that.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us on this StreamYard. Thank you to everyone that's tuned in to watch. If you head over to the national.scot, you'll be able to get a recap of everything that's happened today. We've still got a live blog running with all the updates. It's likely to go on for quite some time, and recaps of FMQs. If you want to head over to our socials, there's plenty of clips on there as well. And you can also subscribe to the National. We've got a fantastic offer running at the moment. It's just £20 for the entire year. And yeah, thank you so much to Lucy. Thanks, Hamish, and enjoy the rest of your day, folks. Thanks for joining us.